Okie dokie. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back if this is not the first members lecture that you've joined recently, and a very warm welcome if it is indeed your first one. We're delighted to welcome Jessica Clarke this evening, and I will give a longer introduction to her and her work. Just a little reminder first before we get going. It's lovely to see some of you tonight as well visually. We will all remain muted during the talk, but then at the end there is of course the opportunity for you here live to ask questions. So please do so by using the chat button, and Jessica will come to those at the end, and we look forward to receiving them. Just a little heads up as well about our next member event, which is the next in our online series. So that's on Tuesday, the 24th of June. You'll notice we're swapping evenings a little bit just so to try and make sure that there's a date that works for everybody. So Tuesday, the 24th of June, with Dr. Dominic Perring, who will be talking all about Roman London. And he will be really excitingly giving us a sense of virtual reality as well. So that's going to be a brilliant one, and we hope that you'll be able to join us then. As always, the recording will be available on the member area, and you can look back over the last couple of lectures that we've enjoyed so far in the series and watch them via the YouTube links. So, it's such a thrill to have Dr. Jessica Clarke here with us. Jessica's a historian and an archaeologist who specialises, of course, in ancient Roman theatre and entertainment, which we're going to hear a little bit more about this evening. Jessica studied at University College London, where she received her undergraduate, postgraduate, and PhD. She currently is also working as an archaeologist for the Museum of London Archaeology. But you may also know her as our incumbent expert in residence here at the CA. So you've hopefully been enjoying Jessica's interviews, which we've done on the Classics podcast recently. Those are all available again on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. So you can have a listen to those to find out a bit more about Jessica's personal life, her work life. And in the last episode, she answered lots of audience questions as well. So do have a listen to those. So I'm going to pass you over to Jessica because she's here to tell us all about Pompey's theatre, her area of specialism, and why it was in fact the greatest show on earth.
Thank you very much, Katrina, for that very kind introduction. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and you can also see the slides. Just give me a shout if not. But if not, I will get started. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about Pompey's theatre. I've called it the greatest show on earth, with a question mark as well, because hopefully we're going to think quite critically about Pompey's theatre today, thinking about it as a building and also its very long tradition that it's part of, in part in Italy at the time. So just to get started, in autumn of 55 BC, Pompey the Great, one of the most powerful generals of the late Roman Republic, opened his brand new theatre. It was the first theatre ever to be constructed in ancient Rome, and it marked the beginning of what was to become the city's increasingly lavish and politically significant entertainment culture. It was located in the Campus Martius, so just behind the Capitoline Hill, sort of on the outskirts of the city, and it was a monumental structure, a permanent reminder of the extraordinary political and military achievements of Pompey's career. But how well do we really know this theatre? How good is our source material? Have scholars been making sufficient use of the source material that actually is available to us? Can we avoid some quite well-trodden paths of historical inquiry? And can we move in some new directions? These are all questions that I want to talk about today. I want to revisit Pompey's theatre, this well-known wonder of the ancient world, and reconsider the source material from which we've built a lot of our kind of traditional interpretations, and try and rediscover its place and its significance within the Roman world, and also the Mediterranean world much more generally. All of this work comes originally from my PhD research, and then is also a portion of my new book, which is a new history of ancient Roman theatre, which is out in December. Quite excitingly, it's available for pre-order at Liverpool University Press. And the area that I'm talking about today kind of comes primarily from chapter 4 of this new book. To start off, though, before I talk too much about the source material or start reconstructing what the theatre might have been like, I want to just make a brief comment about methodology. My research has very deliberately adopted, over the course of about 6 years, a very specific and a new approach to ancient Roman theatre. To get new answers and to reappraise quite an old subject that has been talked about quite extensively, we need to make sure we use all the available evidence, so from the archaeological to the literary. Both types of source material can provide very unique insights into the workings of ancient Rome, but neither should be used in isolation. This is an approach that's been influenced by two scholars. They've had a lot of influence on my work, and that's Daniel Padilla-Peralta and Seth Bernard, who are at Princeton University. And they proposed a new framework for how we should study, well, they were specifically talking about Rome and Italy in the Middle Republican period. So aiming to tackle the differences and the difficulties of reconstructing the Middle Republican period, which is some very fragmentary and very contested source material, they suggested the creation of a new and connected methodology, trying to reappraise the old subject and open new lines of historical inquiry. As part of their methodology, they advocated very strongly for the constructive integration of archaeological material into historical research. So injecting not only new evidence, but also updating current methods for how we synthesize evidence into our existing interpretations of the Roman past. The only potential barrier to this approach, as they very succinctly put it, and I've included the quotes on the slide, they said that early scholarship tended to view material culture as auxiliary to other, especially textual, forms of analysis for the reconstruction of the early Roman past. So today, whilst great strides have been made, it's still very common to find historical work on the period turning to the archaeological largely to supplement or to verify information that's found in the literary sources. So what they mean by this really is that we tend to treat archaeological material not as being of equal weight and importance in its own right, as having its own requirements, its own interpretations, its own value. And often it's simply just a way of supplementing what we think we already know in the literature and supporting what we already know. And this is a state of affairs that Padilla-Peralta and Bernard correctly assert calls for a reassessment of both the historical questions we ask and the approaches that we employ. So the intention of all of my research has been not to use archaeological sources just to explain or to justify the literary record. Instead, my aim is always to place the archaeological sources in what I call constructive dialogue with the surviving literature, trying to find points of similarity, but also to acknowledge points of difference and where the two records diverge from each other, which they often do. So when we're thinking about Pompey's theatre, some of the questions that we can think about, and we will think about in this lecture, are, for example, what happens if we place Plutarch's famous description of Pompey's theatre in the context of theatre building in Italy? Do we still find that Plutarch is a convincing testimony? Or do we find actually we need to adapt and reorientate our historical questions? Does the literature actually support the archaeological, or do we find that points of difference are emerging? Just to summarize this before we move on to the actual source material, Padilla-Peralta and Bernard very compellingly summarize, and I haven't included this quote on the slide, but I'll just read it out briefly. Archaeology produces vectors of historical information that intersect productively with other lines of historical inquiry, but do not necessarily travel in the same direction or at the same pace. In this sense, we view the spade work of connecting archaeology and history as furnishing the basis of a new form of connectivity. And my research has very much been this spade work, trying to find new and interesting ways to handle the archaeological material without just simply using it as a way of illustrating something we might know from the literature. So with all that being said, what are the sources for Pompey's theatre? All that remains today is really the outline of what would have been the front row of seats, which you can see in the Via di Grotta Pinta in Rome. There's a picture on the slide, and you can see sort of the slightly gentle curve of the buildings, and that would have been the front row of the seats, sort of around the orchestra. The building, well, the theatre fell into disuse in the Middle Ages, and by 1296, the Orsini family had bought it and the other buildings around the site, and they'd combined it into a fortress with a tower overlooking the Campo di Fiori. So in this illustration that you can see that comes from 1606, you can see the Campo di Fiori here with the sort of tents set out in the middle. And then you can see this kind of oval of houses with a tower in the middle. And that is where the theatre would have been, and it's been kind of co-opted and transformed into these different residential buildings and into this fortress. The intention of this fortress being that it could overlook the Via Valeria, which was the key way of getting down to the Kingdom of Naples in the south. So in the Middle Ages, it had a very important strategic and military purpose. Theoretical reconstructions of what the theatre might have looked like started to be drawn around the first half of the 19th century with an architect called Luigi Canina. He was also one of the first to undertake excavations on the site. He was trying to confirm the extent and the architectural character of the theatre. One of the very early major finds from the theatre was in 1965, and this was a huge statue of Hercules, which is now in the Vatican Museum. And the picture on the slide is it in situ, exactly as you can see it in the Vatican today. It was discovered in the southeast corner of the foundations of the temple of the theatre. And the other image on the slide is it being winched out of the ground very dramatically. Over the years, there's been various different excavations at the site, including some very recent ones. We've had some quite recently, some trenches were opened up, trying to get a better understanding of the theatre's design and trying to get a more accurate floor plan of the building. And then as well as these excavations, quite a lot of our knowledge of the theatre comes from something called the Severan marble plan. So this was a massive marble plan of ancient Rome, created under the reign of Septimus Severus. So that's around 203 to 211 CE. This huge marble map measured about 18 meters wide and about 13 meters high, and it was inside the Temple of Peace in Rome. We've got sort of lots of fragments of this map, and very fortunately, we've got a fragment that shows the theatre of Pompey. It's labelled, as you can see on the slide, as Theatrum. You can see the radial foundations of the seating structures, and you can also see sort of behind the stage where the gardens would have stretched out behind it, and we'll talk a bit more about those gardens in a moment. From these various archaeological sources and from the very helpful marble plan, we can begin to construct what the theatre was like using illustrations, physical models, and then increasingly 3D models and virtual reality. The illustration that I've included on this slide comes from 1915, and I've included it because although it is quite an old illustration now, I think it's one of the better ones, and it really does, I think, show the scale of the building, and it is quite accurate as well for the design and the layout of the facade. So here I'm going to give you a quick tour of Pompey's theatre. I'm going to use primarily images from Sophie Madeleine's reconstruction of the theatre, which she published in 2015, part of her virtual reality project that she did. A few of the elements of her reconstruction are a bit contested, so I'll highlight those when they come up, but it's probably the best version that exists so far, and it's a really good way of getting a sense of the space and kind of imagining what it might have been like. So as you approach the theatre, it would have risen about 4 stories tall, dwarfing the surrounding buildings. Red marble columns ran around the curve of the facade, and in the arch niches all the way around the perimeter would have been hundreds of marble statues, sort of looking down on the crowds as they arrived to enter the theatre on opening day. Once inside the theatre, after passing through vaulted archways that led into the interior, you would have found yourself in the auditorium, which could have seated somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 spectators. Pliny, who's one of our ancient writers, he gives a number of about 40,000 spectators, but that is a wild overestimate. Pliny's not correct about that. And we'll talk more about Pliny's mathematical problems when he's talking about theatres slightly later on in this talk, because it's much more accurate that it's somewhere between 15 and 20,000, although scholars will give you sort of slightly different variations, but it will be in that range. For comparison, the theatre at Pompey, which just south of Rome, which predates Pompey's theatre by about 100 years, could seat about 5,000 spectators. The Colosseum, to give you kind of the other end, the other extreme, can seat about 50,000 spectators. So the Theatre of Pompey is giving you about 30 to 40% of the Colosseum. So it's an extraordinarily large and impressive building. In this image, this reconstruction, you can see the vellum, the sunshade that's been pulled across to shelter the audience from the hot Roman sun. We actually have a reference about the effect of these sunshades and how it affected the light and the experience of being in a theatre from the writer Lucretius. He's not referring directly to the Theatre of Pompey, but he is broadly contemporary. He comes from about the middle of the 1st century BC. And we have a passage where he's talking about how colour was thrown around an auditorium based on the colour of the sunshade above the audience's heads. So what he has to say, he says, "This is often done by yellow and red and dark purple awnings. When outspread in the public view over a great theatre, upon posts and beams surfaces, they tremble and flutter, for then they die, and force to flutter in their own colour the assembly in the great hollow below, and all the display of the stage. And the more the walls of the theatre are enclosed all round, the more all within laughs in a flood of beauty, when the light of the day is thus confined." So that's a very beautiful description of just how immersive the experience could be being in a theatre with the sunshades across, and sort of how the light kind of danced across the audience members. So back to inside the theatre, Pompey himself might have sat in the front row of seats with the senators. Senators had their own roped off section of seats at the front, or he might have sat in a separate box. Madeleine's reconstruction, she has Pompey in a separate box. This is plausible. We don't really have any evidence either way, but certainly by the time of the Roman emperors, they would have sat in their own box when the theatre was still in use under the Roman Empire. And this is a very nice reconstruction that you can see on the slide. For comparison, I've also included this other image which shows the very back of the auditorium, and this would have been where the very poorest members of society would have been permitted to stand. So slaves, prostitutes, you might have had merchandise salesmen, food vendors. This is a general walkway. So just to give you the other end of the social spectrum from Pompey at the very front of his theatre. I personally find that the only problem with these kind of reconstructions, while they're amazing at showing the space, is that they don't tend to show the liveliness, the mess, the chaos that also would have been going on in a Roman theatre. And if you look at illustrations of theatres, they always tend to be shown with less than half the audience in attendance. So if you look at the image on the slide at the very top, this is an illustration of the Theatre of Pompey, and it's got a very meagre audience in attendance. And you'll notice that that's often the case with illustrations of Roman theatres. And I think that's to do with us often not giving enough credit to just how significant a performance of a theatre performance in the Roman world was, and just how packed and heaving and messy. There would have been shouting going on, people would be shouting at the stage, there would have been vendors moving around trying to sell things, fights would have been breaking out. It would have been a very lively environment. So that's something that we kind of have to imagine for ourselves when we're looking at these reconstructions. Just to give you an idea of the comparison for size of the auditorium of Pompey's theatre, we can look very briefly at some examples of Roman theatres that are still standing. These obviously post-date, they're after Pompey, but they're quite helpful in terms of helping us imagine what it might have been like to sit in the auditorium. So on the slide, we've got the Theatre Orange, which is from the Augustan period and could seat about 7,000 to 10,000 spectators. The Theatre at Vienne, which dates to slightly later, to the Claudian period, seating about 13,500 spectators. And then finally, the theatre at Leptis Magna in Africa. Again, this is an Augustan theatre, but it's probably the closest in terms of size to Pompey's theatre, so it's about 16,000 spectators. The attention of all of these spectators would have been directed to the towering stage set, which would have been elaborately decorated, about 3 stories high, covered in statues and brightly coloured marble columns. For scale, the individual that you can see stood in the middle of the stage is about 5'6" in this reconstruction. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the stage. Above the auditorium, at the top of the tiers of ranked seating, was a vast temple to the goddess Venus. Some reconstructions have bronze statues on the top of the temple, some put statues inside the temple. It can vary depending on which scholar has made and which virtual reality maker has made the image. I'll talk a bit more later about how common it was in Italy to have temples and theatres as part of the same building. But Pompey's choice of Venus was by no means an accident. Pompey had been cultivating a connection with the goddess for over a decade at this point, claiming her as his divine patron. We can see Venus on Pompey's coins throughout the 60s and 50s. And his placement of her temple at the top of his theatre is sort of a crowning moment in stating his divine connection to her. So this coin in particular, we've got on the obverse Venus, and on the reverse, we've got 3 trophies, each meant to represent one of Pompey's huge victories in the Mediterranean and also in the Eastern world. So the image is very clear in what it's trying to tell us. It's trying to tell us that because of Venus and her divine protection of Pompey, this is the reason that Pompey has been able to have the successes and achieve this military dominance. And his placement of her temple in his theatre is part of this broader propaganda campaign. Moving out of the theatre now and behind to the gardens, these sort of stretched out behind the stage building, and they were surrounded by porticoed walkways. They were filled with statues, water fountains. Again, these are very helpful reconstructions. We would probably want to imagine them a little bit more colourful, a little bit more lively. The statues would look rather different. But then at the opposite end of the gardens from the theatre would have been the brand new Senate House that Pompey had built. This Senate House was a masterstroke of architectural choreography. In building it, Pompey ensured the Senate meetings would take place under his authority. Inside it, he placed a huge statue of himself, as a sort of permanent reminder of his personal political authority. Reconstructing the Senate House is somewhat of a challenge, as this section of the marble plan is missing. So we don't really know anything about its foundations. And then also there's nothing left of the building because it was burnt down in the riots after Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44. So from our best guesses, the new Senate House would have had some kind of flight of steps leading up to it, probably some kind of columned entranceway leading into a cool, shady interior. On the slide, I've put 2 different reconstructions from 2 different model makers, just to give you an idea of the variety that's possible when we're talking about trying to reconstruct the shape and the size of this building. So far, so good. Using the archaeology and the latest reconstruction tools, we're able to get a pretty good sense of the space. But what about the context? What about context in which Pompey was building, the habits of theatre building that already existed? Was it particularly unusual what Pompey was doing? For this, we need to rely a lot more on the literary sources, and it's at this point that we start running into some problems. There are several prevalent assumptions that dominate the scholarship on Pompey's theatre, that draw on quite a limited evidence of Roman bibliographic, historiographic, and encyclopedic traditions. The first of which is that Pompey's theatre was inspired by a visit to Greece in the 60s BC. This is an idea that comes from Plutarch. In his biography of Pompey in Parallel Lives, which was written towards the end of the 1st century CE, so considerably after the time of Pompey and his theatre, Plutarch recounts Pompey's travels and conquests in the Greek East during the 60s, and he includes his visit to Mytilene, which was the capital city of Lesbos. Plutarch writes, "When he came to Mytilene, he gave the city its freedom for the sake of Theophanes, and he joined the audience for the traditional poetic competition, whose sole theme on this occasion was his exploits. He liked the theatre there so much that he had a sketch made of its form and design so that he could make the one in Rome like it, only larger and on a grander scale. So most existing scholarship tends to take this at face value, and often it's repeated pretty much verbatim. However, there is a bit of a problem with this assertion that the two theatres, one was based on the other, because the theatres are entirely different from each other in design. In the first instance, the theatre at Mytilene follows the very standard design of a Greek theatre. It's got an almost circular orchestra. The stage building is separate from the seating, and also the orchestra is almost circular. And you can see on the slide what the theatre looks like today if you go visit it. Pompey's theatre, on the other hand, had a semicircular orchestra. It had freestanding seating that did not use any banked earth at all to support it, whereas, as you can see on the slide, the theatre Mytilene is entirely dependent on having banked earth. And then also Pompey's theatre, the stage building and the seating are connected to each other in a single building. So with such different designs, it's kind of implausible that Pompey would have used the theatre at Mytilene and copied it and reproduced it exactly as Plutarch suggests. So why does Plutarch say this is what happened? One suggestion has been put forward by Amy Russell, who quotes Plutarch and then observes quite correctly that the connection between Mytilene and Rome, quote, is puzzling because in its architecture, Mytilene's theatre is about as different from Pompey's as a theatre can be. Russell attempts to solve this problem by suggesting that it was not the theatre that really pleased Pompey, but what he wanted to replicate in Rome was the experience of being feted by the assembled poets. So for Russell, the Greek inspiration that Pompey is drawing on is not so much the architecture, but the Hellenistic experience of spectacular power that Pompey had experienced and wanted to replicate. And this is a very compelling suggestion. It foregrounds that Plutarch is probably not necessarily accurate about design influences. However, Russell does still assume that Plutarch's testimony is an accurate account of Pompey's attitude towards the Greek world, whereas I would argue, on the other hand, that Plutarch is not necessarily a particularly reliable narrator when it comes to Greece's influence on Rome. Throughout Parallel Lives, Plutarch has a very clear narrative intention and a literary construction. He frames his biographies as moral and ethical discussions to present his reader with positive and negative examples of various different great men from Greek and Roman history. He does not set himself up as a historian, although in a few places he does cite his sources. He does mention Poseidonus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Livy, the autobiographies of Sulla and Marius. But throughout the work, he consistently tries to show the influence of his native Greece on the Roman world and the significance of the great Greek heroes as parallels for Roman generals. So much of the work is dedicated to bridging the gap between Greece and Rome, and Plutarch very likely has a Greek as well as a Roman audience in mind when he's writing. So this viewpoint is essential, in my opinion, to connect Plutarch's anecdotal evidence on the theatre of Pompey. With a vested interest in emphasizing Greek influence on key figures of Roman history, Plutarch may have chosen to deliberately emphasize that Mytilene had an influence on Pompey's design choices. Indeed, by suggesting that the first permanent theatre in Rome was a direct copy of an earlier Greek theatre, Plutarch is identifying a specific Greek influence on one of the largest architectural monuments in the city of Rome. Plutarch does not seem concerned at the complete lack of architectural similarities between the two buildings. This leads us on to another problem that we run into when we're looking at the literature and we're trying to understand the context of Pompey's theatre. So it's often assumed that Pompey's theatre was the culmination of quite a long tradition of building temporary stages in Rome, and that there was quite a few very extravagant temporary stages built in the 50s, about the same time that Pompey was building his theatre, and that these were taken down. We need to look at Pliny to understand these temporary theatres. In his Natural Histories, Pliny tells us that there were two grand theatres built in Rome that were unceremoniously pulled down again. He describes, first of all, the theatre of Marcus Aemilius Scaurus in 58 BC. And this is what he has to say about it. It's quite a long quote, but it's worth reading as it goes into quite a lot of detail. Please ignore the very last sentence there. that shouldn't be there. That needs to be removed. That comes from a footnote. So please ignore that last bit. So Pliny says this was his theatre, which had a stage arranged in 3 stories with 360 columns. The lowest story of the stage was of marble and the middle one of glass, an extravagance unparalleled even in later times, while the top story was made of gilded planks. The columns in the lowest story were, as I have stated, each 386 feet high. The bronze statues in the spaces between the columns numbered 3,000, as I mentioned earlier. As for the auditorium, it accommodated 80,000, and yet that of Pompey's theatre amply meets all requirements with seats for 40,000. The rest of the equipment, with dresses of cloth of gold, scene paintings, and other properties, were of so lavish a scale that when the surplus knickknacks that could be put to ordinary use were taken to Scaurus's villa at Tusculum, and the villa itself was set on fire and burnt down by indignant servants, the loss was estimated at 30 million sesterci. So according to Pliny, what we've got here is a theatre that was one of the greatest buildings ever made by man, and yet never intended to last forever. And it was only built for the games of Scaurus and then was pulled down, and any remaining ornaments were taken to Scaurus's villa, and then the outraged servants burnt down the villa. There are some problems here, though. Primarily with Pliny's maths. All of Pliny's measurements are provided in Roman pedes, which we can convert to metric meters using a conversion rate of 1 Roman foot to 0.296 metric meters. Thus, if the columns on the ground floor were 386 Roman feet, then this would be approximately 114.3 meters. This number is far too large to be accurate. For comparison, the Great Pyramid at Giza is approximately 139 meters. And if we were to include the other 3 stories, then this would make the theatre about 342.9 meters, which would make it slightly smaller than the Empire State Building. Another example is that Pliny says there are 3,000 statues placed in between each of the columns. If there are 360 columns, according to Pliny, then a quick calculation tells us there would have been at least 8 bronze statues between each column. Furthermore, Pliny says that the capacity is 80,000, which is more than double the size of the Theatre of Pompey, if he's accurate about the capacity of Pompey's theatre being 40,000, which we know he's not. 40,000 is double what the capacity of Pompey's theatre would have been. If he is accurate about this theatre, it would have been the same capacity roughly as the Colosseum, which is just a very implausible suggestion. This is also the case with Pliny's other description of a theatre. Pliny continues his narrative with a description of a second marvel of ancient engineering, which he says was built by Gaius Scribonius Curio in 53 BC. He says that Curio built close to each other 2 very large wooden theatres, each poised and balanced on a revolving pivot. During the forenoon, a performance of a play was given in both of them, and they faced in opposite directions, so the 2 casts should not drown each other's words. Then, all of a sudden, the theatres revolved, and it is agreed that after the first few days, they did so with some of the spectators actually remaining in their seats. Their corners met, and thus Curio provided an amphitheatre in which he produced fights between gladiators, though they, the gladiators, were less at risk than the Roman people itself, as they were whirled around by Curio. And on the slide, I've included an illustration of what this might have looked like if Pliny is accurate. However, again, according to Pliny, even if this was this sort of multifunctional revolving theatre, amphitheatre, it would also have been demolished after Curio's games had finished. And some scholars have looked into the mechanisms as Pliny describes them in order to have this revolving mechanism, and no one has been able to make it work yet. It doesn't seem to be feasible, at least in the way that Pliny describes it. So again, we need to be very careful with Pliny as a source, especially for the context of theatre building in Rome. His natural histories seem to be a work of quite uneven accuracy, and they belong to a very specific literary tradition in the 1st century with lots of exaggeration. These exaggerations fit with the broader intention of Pliny's narrative in his work, where he repeatedly bemoans the decadent luxury that led up to the collapse of the Republic. He has lots of concerns over moral decline, which is a very strong motif within quite a lot of the Roman historiographic tradition at the time. We can find it in authors like Livy, in Sallust, also in Appian, where these scholars, these writers rather, hold up the early Republic as this kind of ideal of political order and moral rectitude. And then they contrast that with the late Republic and this increasing decadence. And Pliny makes his disgust at this decadence quite clear when he's talking about these two theatres. And he even draws a comparison between these theatres and the emperors Caligula and Nero. So he writes that even their madness, meaning the madness of Nero and Caligula, was outdone by the resources of a private individual, Marcus Scaurus, whose aedileship may perhaps have done more than anything to undermine morality, and whose powerful ascendancy may have been a more mischievous attempt on the part of his stepfather Sulla than the killing by prescription of so many thousands of people. As Edel, he constructed the greatest of all works ever made by man, and a work that surpassed not merely those erected for the limited period, but even those intended to last forever. So here we've got Pliny expressing his absolute disgust at that Scaurus was able to build the theatre that he says he built, and that it was. He's pretty clear that there is a connection between Scaurus's theatre and a decline in morality. He's employing very hyperbolic language, and he says that the theatre is perhaps even worse for the national character of Rome than the prescriptions of Sulla. If you add this with the very exaggerated size of the theatre, then it fits in with the sort of over-the-top language that Pliny is using. Aside from Pliny, we've got no other attestations really of late Republic contemporary stages like this. In several instances, Cicero does refer to some very extravagant games that are put on by his peers. He refers to Lucius Crassus's games, also Gaius Claudius's, but he doesn't ever mention these sort of huge theatre buildings that were meant to be the size of the Colosseum. The only possible exception is perhaps Tacitus, who does make a brief comment in Book 14 of the Annals that there may have been theatres that were temporary, that were put up and then taken down each year, and that this was a huge expense. However, again, the Annals was completed some 150 years later, at the end of the Republic. And also this passage from Tacitus is very much based on an earlier passage from Livy, and Livy's way of talking about early Roman theatres is sort of a topic for its own lecture. But essentially, Tacitus is expressing his shock at the idea that such marvels would have been put up and then taken down. So even Tacitus, only about 100 years later, is slightly surprised that such a thing would have happened. So from this reevaluation of the literary evidence of temporary theatres in Rome, it's essential to correctly contextualize Pompey's theatre. If we were to take Pliny's evidence completely seriously and at face value, then we'd get the impression that Rome was very frequently building theatres and then tearing them down again. It also implies that Rome was very used to building theatrical spaces and then discarding them. In this context, Pompey's theatre would seem to be a culmination of Rome's habit of building theatres, specifically in Rome. But really, we should look outside Rome and across the Italian peninsula if we're looking for Pompey's inspiration and for a habit of theatre building that was leading up to the construction of the first theatre in Rome. And we can understand, in my opinion, the influences on Pompey's theatre much better if we look at the archaeological record of Italy, which very surprisingly, a lot of scholars haven't really focused on over the years. The map on the screen is from my own research, and you can see some of the theatres that predate Pompey's theatre being mapped across the peninsula. We've got at least 33 theatres that we know were built in Italy before Pompey opened his theatre. And on this map, we've got the ones that were built in the early 3rd century and in the 2nd century. These include, for example, Bologna, Castelsecco, Gabi, Praeneste, Lanuvium, Tium Sidicum, Iuvanum, Pietrobondante, Cales, Talicia, Capua, Sarno, Pompey, Nusia Alfaterna, Corralis, and Segista. Sicily also had a lot of other theatres at the time, which aren't visible on this map because they're built in the 5th and 4th and early 3rd century. But if the map was reflecting all the theatres that existed, then there'd be much more density of dots on Sicily and in South Italy. This map is just showing very specific period from the 3rd century to the 2nd century. So to look at a couple of examples, a fantastic example is the theatre at Praeneste, just south of Rome, which was constructed as part of an enormous temple complex for the goddess Fortuna Primigenia. This theatre had hemispherical steps, which sat on the north side of a vast terrace that was part of an immensely impressive temple, which had spectacular views of the surrounding countryside. Based on the location of the theatre seating, we can assume that performances were held in honour of the goddess Fortuna, and as a method of pleasing the goddess with theatrical offerings. Unfortunately, we don't have much textual or epigraphic record that indicates how often the performances were held in this theatre, but based on its centrality within the temple complex, its size, and the amount of money it would have cost to build this theatre, and also the manpower, certainly it was a very important component of religious worship just outside of Rome and built 100 years earlier. It makes it one of the many theatre temples that existed in Italy that long predate Pompey. Some others are at Gabi, Tinum Sidicum, Pietro Abondante, and Sarno. A particularly extraordinary example, is the one you can see on the slide. It was built in the 2nd century, again, about 100 years or so before Pompey's theatre. And it's actually surprisingly how little this theatre is discussed. It's perched on the top of a hill in the province of Caserta, again, commanding fantastic views of the surrounding countryside. It's a marvel of ancient engineering and construction techniques. As a place of performance and also a place of religious worship, it's an excellent example of the long-established tradition of building theatre temples in Italy, and a tradition that Pompey borrowed and expanded. Not only did he build a theatre, he built a temple, and he chose to celebrate with that temple his own divine connections. Another element of consistency in Pompey's theatre with pre-existing theatres in Italy is also the layout of the stage building and the auditorium. So as I've already sort of briefly mentioned, Pompey's theatre had a very specific design with a smaller semicircular orchestra and the seating being attached to the stage building and it being freestanding seating. And this layout we can see emerging from the end of the 3rd century in Italy, so long before Pompey, and sort of gaining increasing momentum and popularity in the late Republican period. These new theatres are very numerous, as you can see on the map. So these are ones built in the late Republican period, reaching all the way down to the very toe of the Italian boot up to Milan in the north. An excellent example of this kind of theatre is the theatre at Pompey. The first phase of this large theatre at Pompey was constructed in the 2nd century. It's obviously one of the best preserved theatres we've got in Italy because of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79. And it's actually still in use today as well for concerts and plays. It was remodeled in the Augustan period, and a smaller theatre, an Odeon, was also added next to it in 75, so just before the eruption, and you can see that clearly with the image on the slide of the sort of the little theatre right next to the big theatre, and also in the aerial view as well that I've included. Both theatres have received more scholarly attention than any of the others for obvious reasons. And there's quite a lot of disagreement over the exact date of the large theatre's sort of earliest incarnations. Some scholars argue for the 2nd century, some suggest sort of early 3rd, others suggest that changes were made at the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 1st. But we can be quite certain that this theatre wasn't associated with any specific deity. This does not mean, of course, the theatre wasn't used for performances in honour of a god or goddess, or for specific festivals, but the building itself doesn't seem to have any permanent association. This may have made it possible for the theatre to hold a variety of different religious events, depending on the requirements of the city's population. The layout of both these theatres, crucially, kind of foreshadow Pompey's theatre, both the freestanding structures, Both can only be accessed through vomitorium from the vomitoria through the perimeter of the seating, and the stage building is connected to the seats. Another impressive example is the theatre that you can see here on the slide. The remains are still standing today, although they're less well preserved than Pompeii. And this is in modern day Umbria. This theatre still has some sections of the freestanding seating, and it probably was from a residential area of the town at the time. Again, scholars do disagree a bit about the date. Likely what we're looking at here is some imperial reconstructions, so later than the actual original theatre was built on the site. Got many other examples of this kind of design from Italy. So just a couple of them are on the slides. There are more, but these are some they give you quite a good image of what they looked like. And you can see the similarities with Pompey's theatre, with the only real difference being the size. And the theatre of Pompey being significantly larger and needing to have slightly different construction techniques in order to support the magnitude and the change in the size of the building. Most of these theatres, including the three that are on the slide, have got capacities sort of between 3,000 and 5,000, and the theatre at Guvium, which I've just shown here, has got a capacity of about 3,700 to 4,600, roughly. Pompey's theatre obviously could hold more than double this number, and also would have been paid for by Pompey personally. On his return from the East, Pompey would have brought back a huge quantity of war booty with him, which permitted the construction of a theatre on such a large scale, and also lots of other displays of his public munificence in the city. According to our best estimates, the theatre alone cost around about 30 million sesterci, which roughly is about 263 million pounds today. And then if you include the Temple of Venus, the decorations, the furnishing for the building as well, the cost probably gets closer to about 50 million sesterci, which is about 436 million pounds today. So in my opinion, the magnified size of Pompey's theatre is an excellent example of Rome importing an architectural design from elsewhere in the Italian peninsula, and in the process making it significantly larger and more impressive. Right at the beginning of Rome starting to become this imperial power base at the beginning of the empire. So by way of conclusion, I just want to return to some of the questions that I began with. So first, how good is our source material? The source material for the Theatre of Pompey and theatre in Rome generally is quite uneven. We have sufficient archaeological evidence to recreate the form and the design of the theatre and to create excellent 3D modules and virtual reconstructions. For the context of the theatre and its influence, its position in the Roman and Italian habits of theatre and theatre building, our literary evidence alone is rather unsatisfactory. It is at times quite worryingly inaccurate, and it is certainly shaped by the intentions of the writers and the specific context in which the writers were writing, which is often many, many years after the events that they're actually talking about. Much more telling is the archaeology of Italian theatres, which is very often overlooked in studies of Roman theatre. And these theatres can tell us much more about the long tradition of theatre building in Italy and its eventual culmination in the magnificent creation that is Pompey's theatre in Rome. As to our other questions, can we use new source material? Can we integrate it? Can we use new connected methodologies to avoid well-trodden paths and to move in new directions? I think the answer is certainly yes. There's a huge scope for further study if we foreground the archaeology of ancient theatre, rather than just focusing the very, very well-known literature. And also if we don't subordinate the archaeology to the literature. And I think my work has really only just begun to scratch the surface of this very rich and very rewarding source material. So to conclude, I think we're left with a lingering question, and that is one that I begin to answer in my book. Why did Rome not have a theatre for so long when across Italy huge stone edifices were being built as symbols of civic pride for at least 2 centuries before Pompey ever built his theatre in Rome? Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was wonderful, and thank you so much as well for directly challenging those sources, making us think about all the different types of material we're looking at, comparing the picture across the rest of the Italian peninsula. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I know one's already come in. So, whilst others are thinking of writing their questions, we'll come to Penny's question, which I know you touched on just in the latter part of the talk there. But she was asking what type of performances were envisaged and produced in this theatre in particular, pure drama as we know it, or spectacles such as took place in amphitheatres as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we know on the opening day of Pompey's theatre that two Greek tragedies were performed. Sorry, they were the Latin versions of Greek tragedies. So Pompey chose to have the Clytemnestra by Accius's version, and also the Trojan Horse, which I believe he chose, I think it was Nevius's version. So we know that the performance of tragedies was common, and that Pompey wanted that for his opening day. In terms of similarities with amphitheatres, certainly there were performances of gladiators in the theatre. Again, on for his opening celebrations, we've got a letter from Cicero talking about what was about the opening day, and he refers to wild beast hunts. He refers to gymnastic performances. He refers to gladiator shows, as well as the sort of more standard theatre shows. He's very rude about all of them. He thinks that they are sort of over the top spectacles. They don't really live up to his idea of what a tasteful performance should be. But it is a very helpful source in telling us exactly what was being performed, at the very least on that opening week of performances.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent answer. Do type your questions or raise a hand if indeed you'd like to speak your question. Um, I did have a question though in the meantime, which is around we know of some riots taking place and forms of violence in the theatre in other parts of Italy. Is there any evidence for this at Pompey's theatre, or can you tell us a bit more about the political nature of what Pompey's doing here?
Yeah, so we've got evidence of a riot happening in Pompeii, that perhaps when you're thinking about it, that took place in an amphitheatre. We've got an amazing a fresco from Pompeii showing this riot taking place. In terms of riots in Pompey's theatre, we don't have any direct evidence of a riot taking place specifically in the theatre of Pompey, but we do have a lot of evidence for increasing riots throughout the late Republican period and for unrest in the theatre. A good example which might have motivated Pompey wanting to take control of the theatre and making sure that he didn't receive this kind of criticism again was a few years before his theatre opened. He was at a performance of a play, and apparently, according again to a letter from Cicero, he was addressed by one of the actors from the stage who said to him, "To our misfortunes, you are great." And then apparently the crowd loved this. They went wild, and then the actor did multiple encores of the same line. So I think it's very clear that the theatre was a place for the populace to get out of hand if they so wished. Often the politicians, when they arrived, could be booed. How they were received in the theatre was very important. Again, we've got a good reference to Julius Caesar arriving at a theatre and not receiving the reception he wanted, but then behind him, a much younger politician arriving and getting a standing ovation, and Caesar being very concerned by this and instantly writing a letter to Pompey, who he was allied to at the time, to talk about, how serious this problem was, that he's not being received well in the theatre. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question about kind of the political context of the theatre at the time.
It does indeed. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from our audience? I've had one come through on the message, which was what is the evidence for Roman women in the theatre?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've got quite good evidence for women in the theatre. unlike the Greek world where women were excluded, we've got I mean, scholars disagree slightly, but I think the evidence is very good for women being in the theatre. We've got a prologue from one of Plautus's plays where the prologue speaker addresses the crowd, and he works through the different members of the audience, telling everyone to be quiet and to sit down and to listen. And he directly addresses Roman women. He says, "Don't bother your husbands; they get enough of you at home. Please sit quietly. And if you've got a child with you, please keep the child quiet to stop driving everyone mad." And so that's pretty good evidence from the 2nd century that women were sat in the crowd and that they weren't sat separately from their husbands. Otherwise, there'd be no need to tell them to not annoy your husband. By the time we get to the Augustan period, it's quite likely that women, certainly unmarried women, were being sat separately because Augustus introduces much more formal legal restrictions about where you can sit in the stands. And women certainly are sitting separately by that point. Also, we've got a quote from the poet Ovid, who is pining after the young woman that he's in love with, who is sat sort of across from him in the theatre. So again, tells us that the women were there, but maybe by the empire they were being sectioned off.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jessica. Final call for any more questions for Jessica. If you don't think of them now, but you think of them later, Jessica is still in her post as our expert in residence for the next month. So we do have a form on our website. If you go to the expert in residence page, there is a little form where you can drop any questions that you have, and I will pass those along to Jessica. So worry not if you don't have a question right now. Penny says, "I never imagined that theatres in Rome were temporary before this time." Yeah, it's a strange thought. It's just not something that we think of when we think of the magnificent structures both in the Roman and ancient world, and also that we have today that you don't think of as been temporary.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's certainly questions around how good our evidence is for these amazing temporary theatres and whether or not we can believe some of Pliny's more outlandish claims.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. I know there's already been applause and thank yous in the chat. A huge thank you from all of us. That was such an erudite, knowledgeable talk. And we're very excited for your book. Good luck with the rest of the research. And I know that we might get a little sneak peek with a blog coming our way as well. So thank you so much for being our expert and thank you for your talk tonight. It's been such a pleasure to listen.